So we're going to jump into another section of kind of Q&A and discussion. I know we're kind of at the end of the time we planned, but I think there's enough people that are interested that we want to keep going and kind of actually have that discussion. But before people, if people can't stay and they have to go, I want to thank all of the presenters up front already for some fantastic talks. Thanks for taking the time to put together that material and present it. The work was incredible. Also, thanks to Cassie for all the logistical support, SEPM and Jen, and again, huge shout out to Lilian and Emma that put in a huge amount of work to get everything set up. So thanks again for that. There are quite a few questions that are starting to show up, even though my computer is going a little slow. But one thing I'll kind of bring up again to generate more discussion is I just want to share one slide that kind of tries to summarize a couple of the key points that we want, again, just really wanted to emphasize. So I think one of the key points of this actual session of this conference, right, was to kind of illustrate, the ongoing work that is kind of creating that platform for the future directions of deepwater sedimentology and stratigraphy, but also, get that dialogue started. As we saw from that poll, right, there's about a third of the people, have concerns over the future of deepwater sedimentology and stratigraphy. And so I think, it's hard to see the talks that we saw today and not get excited about a whole slew of new topics, a whole slew of new techniques that we can actually use to challenge some long-held assumptions, create some new hypotheses, and actually create that that new knowledge. And so already what we've actually seen today, right, is that there's a whole bunch of, there's a lot of work that's being done on trying to better understand deep marine processes, understand that they're dynamic and interrelated, and actually we might have to build new conceptual models, new depositional models to address those, right? We also saw some pretty excellent work that was focusing on the transport and burial of both modern organic carbon as well as microplastics and pollutants. So there's again, a lot of outcrop work, modern work, ancient work to understand where, from where those sources are coming from and where they're stored, how much. There's a whole amount of work that can be done on better understanding hydrates and kind of bringing together those fields of hydrate exploration from a future energy resource and a drilling risk perspective, and kind of how that merges with deepwater sedimentology and stratigraphy. And then we saw work on forward stratigraphic models and the ability to kind of data mine them as a digital analog that we can actually access in a way that's easier than walking through a really hot outcrop location. It takes time and we can't quantify things in the way we want to. And then we saw some work on submarine landslides, right? These present geohazards. They also present, the sources of some of those sediment gravity flows that we're trying to understand where they then go and deposit. So I think there's a huge amount of interesting work in terms of topics, but also what was kind of consistent throughout, I think, all these talks, and after that I'll stop, is just that how all these topics are also intersecting the fact that we're seeing, rapid rates and high volume of data collection and data creation, whether that's digital analog data, whether that's modern seafloor data or satellite imagery data. This is also coinciding with much more accessible tools for data analysis, and we can use those in conjunction, right, to kind of convert those analytics into insights that might actually help us develop those next gen concepts. So I think there's a lot to be excited about. Hopefully that kind of also steers in some ideas on some of the questions. I see a few right here. So for the presenters, can you all turn on your cameras again? I think for everyone that would be good, not just if you're being asked a question right now. So the first question that popped up on my screen was from Ramon Lopez, and it's for the presenters on gas hydrates. And the question is are you aware of the facies/sedimentary structure models that could be used to recognize structures in ancient outcrops created by the migration and escape of gas hydrates? Are there any publications on this, and could you share those that you think are best? He's found a few, but not really convincing because of a lack of real world data. I think it's a really interesting question. Jess and Alexei, you know, take it away if you've got some ideas on that.
Hey Jess, hey all. I think I can start really briefly, like just throw an idea, and if you have something else, just jump in. So let's just to clarify, we're talking about the traditional terrestrial landscape, right? Outcrop onshore. And we're trying to understand if there was hydrate in this, let's say, sediment package or not. If that is the question, then the first thing that comes to my mind is we have to understand that well, hydrates are not stable at the atmospheric pressure. So it means at some point they have dissociated, and this point is when the sea level dropped below about 500 meters of water depth. What happens then is your hydrate dissociate at the seafloor, creating the pockmarks, and also there is this biogeochemical process called the formation of orthogenic carbonates, and those are pretty thick carbonate crusts. And that is the great evidence for ancient methane seepage. And if that can be connected somehow to hydrate dissociation, if these carbonate crusts at some point were exposed to the subaerial environment, and then we can see them in the outcrops, and that happens, and there are papers on that, and I can definitely send a couple of papers about that. And that's my first kind of big point that I wanted to share with. I don't know if Jess can think about something else.
No, that sounds about right. So generally, you're not going to see evidence directly for the hydrate having been there, because obviously, like Lexi said, it disappears. You might see the fact that hydrate can act like a cement, so potentially you could see some alteration factors, and that it might be that you've had a layer which was more resistant to erosion. But I think it's the combination of looking for things like the dissociation features, so maybe pockmarks, maybe orthogenic carbonates that relate to seepage associated with hydrates. But of course, they can also be formed just through free gas coming up, not necessarily just hydrates. So a combination of that, plus thinking about what would be the paleo environment. So what was water depth? Would it be the right conditions for hydrate to have been there in the first place? And there are also obviously geochemical indicators you can look for. So you can look at things like the carbon isotope composition. Does that fit with what you'd expect for hydrates? And there's some work being done in things like lipid biomarkers, and using that as actually indications where you've had dissociation of hydrates in the past. That's not my area of specialty, so I'm probably not the best person to advise on it, but there are publications around there.
Excellent. All right, the next question we got is from Brian Romans. This is to Peter. Very interesting study / hypothesis on the greenhouse versus the icehouse shelves. How should we think about the inheritance from previous phases? That is, shelves are constructed over long periods of time. Have you looked at trends when accounting for the overall duration?
So yeah, it's a good question, Brian. I think the simple answer is no, we haven't looked for that yet, because I'm not sure there's enough data in the examples that we've got to really do it in a meaningful way. We've got like 8 or 9 systems. I don't know that they span enough different systems to really get a grip on what you're saying. I mean, in theory, I think we can say that that kind of inheritance definitely will have an effect, but I wonder whether it's maybe at a slightly larger scale. I mean, we can show from modeling studies that, you know, cliniform shelves may lock themselves into a certain width after a certain amount of time, because it's hard for them to prograde beyond the steep slope once it really gets established. So that's going to have some impact. But I think to say more than that at this point, we probably need more data to analyze, which I think, you know, is kind of the next step planned for this work, really.
Those are good points. I think I just lost my list. Oh, okay, so the next is from Tim Demko, where he says that numerical models provide omniscient information on not only deposits but also those flow processes at every node and at every time step. So his question, I guess, is then, should we be constrained to terms for classifying model results like hierarchies of channels, levees, lobes, which are derived from deposits in geomorphology? Could we use the omniscient process information, shear stress, concentration, criticality, et cetera, to classify new ways, or to develop new ways to classify model results and maybe real deposits? guess, Ali and Peter, y'all both have, I'm guessing, some thoughts on that, and I have a few as well, because I think it's an exciting avenue.
Yeah, and I think my talk related really well with Peter's talk of just now that we have access to a lot more information and, the underlying processes that build these products, it does make you question, well, what is a lobe element? How do we, do our definitions of that hierarchy actually hold up when we can now go and examine and test those hypotheses? So I'm glad that that was kind of coming across. And I think that these results, both just examining these model results and then also quantifying these metrics, I mean, even clustering these metrics, I feel like is kind of useful just to see, okay, well, does this break out in a map view, distribution of how we might actually think of these systems? And then thinking back to, okay, well, now if I'm using net to gross or amalgamation ratio and I'm interpreting a well, would that well actually fall in the location, or how unique is that well pattern now that I can compare it to thousands of other well patterns across different environments? So I think definitely using these results to kind of challenge that idea and challenge our existing framework and how we've approached interpretation up to this point, and not being constrained to the framework that we've built, but maybe approaching from that point of view of, okay, well, this is what I think an element should be. Now let me go challenge that or test that. And so I think that's kind of what Peter's talk was pointing to as well.
Yeah, exactly, Ali. I agree. I mean, one thing though is that in the end, the information we're interested in, or the resources that we're interested in, or the hazard information that we're interested in, whatever it is back in the rocks, right? So fundamentally, the models should serve the purpose of allowing us to better understand what the rocks tell us and decode that information. So I don't think we should lose sight of that. And I think there is a risk with the modeling, and I would definitely fall into this category, that you can come up with all sorts of clever ways of analyzing the full information that you have in a model, but it's then very difficult to apply those same methods to analyzing much less complete, sparse data that you get from, particularly from outcrop. So somehow we have to kind of bridge that gap as well. We have to take advantage of what we can do with the more complete data sets and the more complete models in a way that we can then still use some of that at least to get more information out of the more limited data that we have as well.
Yeah, I think the points y'all both made are exactly right. I think it's one of those, we've all kind of, when staring at an outcrop, right? We interpret with certain biases that are based on outcrops we've seen before, or limited well data sets or seismic data sets that we've seen. And I think, the point you made is right. These forward stratigraphic models are there to kind of serve the outcrops and help us interpret them better. But I've definitely, I've spent years of my life staring at outcrops and then looked at a forward stratigraphic model, only to realize that one of those quirks in that outcrop that I never understood what that could be, could potentially be, a strange perspective on a feature that makes perfect sense when you look at it from the flow process standpoint. So I think there is an opportunity to, the depositional models and the classifications that have been built, they were built on a lot of observations, and I think we can refine and make them, for example, a little bit more three-dimensionally or process conscious. And what's kind of interesting is when we look at the models, individual labels might change. Some of the fundamental observations that have been made across outcrops and data sets are, some are consistent and some have to be updated with new things. So I think it's an incredibly exciting avenue to actually look into. And I think, whether it's the forward strat models or even just monitoring all the where plastics are going, for example, I think, you're Florian, your point that you're making about plastic, markers, I think is pretty amazing. I wonder if we're actually going to get new rates of how potentially things like contourites drift. Do they drift at completely different rates if we have increasing high resolution of being able to detect differences in plastics and what years they came out? Well, that was pretty amazing. So there's too much exciting stuff to look into. So here's a question right here from David Gamboa. Maybe an aspect that could be relevant is the scale outcrops may not cover the full scale at which hydrate systems are seen on seismic. And yeah, I think that's a point that, Alexei and Jess, y'all could speak to as well.
Yeah, I guess something that's always tricky when you're looking at outcrops versus seismic. So around New Zealand, for example, we've been looking at paleo-seep sites, which are onshore, but obviously you're seeing something at scale there, which you'd never actually be able to see in seismic. And so trying to relate the two together can be, obviously has challenges. So yeah, bearing that in mind when looking for paleo examples as well is obviously very relevant.
Well, I'll just add that it also depends on the frequency of the seismic data, right? So we can see pretty slim seismic chimneys if we're using some chirp data, for example. It depends on how you define seismic.
This kind of could, this might be, a question. It's kind of random question, might be simplistic, but when it comes to the hydrates, right? They don't obviously they crystallize, right? Is it kind of in situ crystallization up front and kind of growing, or is there actually some migration of the actual kind of gas in the first place prior to the actual crystallization?
It depends, basically. So you can have, there's lots of different ways that hydrate can form. You can have it forming in the interstitial spaces between sediments as really granular, or it can actually form lenses, in which case you will get, essentially will kind of fracture and force sediment apart. So there's lots of different kind of morphologies you can get hydrate in, and that will depend on the exact conditions under which it's forming.
Okay. So I guess would there be something like an interaction between the processes under which it's forming and maybe the actual character of the deposit it's forming in, like the heterogeneities, for example, some of those channels you were looking at, Alexei, versus the levees, depending on, it's interesting to kind of think about, whether it's hydrates or, as we'll kind of talk in the next series of sessions, the heterogeneity, the internal complexity of these deposits that, everyone in this community has been kind of looking at for a while are are just as relevant potentially from the hydrate perspective, from the carbon injection and sequestration perspective, and even just, trying to understand where things are going. So I think it's exciting to see some of the concepts that have been had actually get even, renewed interest because of, because of new energy resources, and well, now we need to store carbon.
Yeah, you're right, Fabien. Here at UT, we're trying to grow hydrates in different types of sediments. We have a lab here, and so we study. It's the more we do it, the more complex it gets. It's just like, you see, like what we're calling the coarse grain sediments is actually like, I've just rechecked the numbers from this site GC955 that just definitely knows very well. It's one of the like natural labs where we've been drilling hydrate for like about 3 years ago. So we find hydrates there is what we call sandy sills, and the grain size there is about 10 to 100 nanometers, and it's a very fine boundary between like a clay sill and sandy sill there, right? So, and still, like when we retrieve this sediment cores under pressure and then we depressurize them, it's a very, very fine grain sediment. So, and it depends very much on where you grow this hydrate. If you're growing it in coarser grain sand or in these finer sediments, and hydrate can grow in different manners and fashions, starting from the grains towards the centers of the pores, from the centers of the pores towards the grains. It depends on how much methane you have, on the concentration of hydrate, initial and final. So it's a very complex process.
Yeah, it's really complicated, and then basically you can start modeling it. You can obviously do with the practical experiments, like Alexei was saying. We've been doing it from kind of like the modeling aspect, I guess. And to get down to that level of detail in the modeling just becomes impossible at kind of basin scale. And so it's a very, it depends on what kind of size you're trying to look at. So yeah, there's just too many factors basically.
Okay, so kind of building on the theme of modeling, right? This is again from David Gamboa. Modeling capacities have been greatly advanced in the application of, to lobes, turbidites, and that's kind of understandable. How applicable can some of these new methodologies to model different types of submarine landslides, and importantly, some of their internal complexity? Guessing that's more of a question for you, Alexander, if you're on.
Yeah, I'm here. I can't really answer to the modeling capacities, how that can be done. However, I can say that for the monitoring, a lot of effort right now is mostly focused on understanding timing of events and the triggers of the events, mostly because that's what's easier to do, even though even though it's quite hard to do. But then getting into the landslide deposit architecture, of course, and how the landslide evolves downslope, then that becomes much more complicated from a monitoring perspective. So modeling can be really interesting. So I'd like to hear maybe others on the modeling perspective for the submarine landslides rather than turbidites.
I think kind of one of the questions I was gonna ask when you were showing some of your work is, have there been further repeat surveys where you didn't detect landslides, but you detected either additional erosion or additional deposition down slope from some of those, maybe kind of highlighting that, you know, those evacuation scarps then are avenues that sediment gravity flows can, you know, things coming off the shelf can capitalize on and actually start flowing down. So actually visualizing or seeing that headward, you know, the development of potential canyons or gullies through that headward erosion.
So, well, we can do that, not specifically in this study, but there's been other studies that have looked at that, mostly in Monterey Canyon. It's probably the best example where they've been able to do some repeat mapping along the canyon thalweg, but also having some EDCPs along the thalweg and trying to see the evolution of turbidity currents going down. In our case, we've been able to see other landslides being formed and in that same repeat survey. And we're not sure exactly what triggered those ones, although we do think that some of them might be also triggered by iceberg just impacting the slope as they're moving in and out. So I'd say, yeah, it is possible to see kind of superficially what's happening in terms of the evolution of submarine turbidity currents and submarine landslides. But then to the specific question of looking at the deposit itself, I suspect that's much harder. And maybe that's where maybe that's where the question about the modeling capacities, which has focused more on turbidity currents, maybe that can be applied to submarine landslides.
Excellent. Another question about hydrates. At which burial depth can gas hydrates still be found? They're almost like a limit on. I guess I wonder if that ties to that gas hydrate stability zone y'all were talking about.
There's a simple answer to that. So it depends on the water depth and geothermal gradient a lot. And if to answer that briefly, you can find them in the water depth starting from like 350 to 400 meters water depths and deeper down to up to 1 kilometer below the sea floor. It's like averagely on Earth. Normally in the Gulf we find them between 300 meters and 900 meters.
Yeah, so around New Zealand it's below 500 roughly, but around places like Antarctica and the Arctic you'll find them potentially shallower because you've got lower geothermal gradients and colder temperatures. So it's just a fresh temperature condition.
Fabien?
Yes.
I think we have to wrap it up, even though, and I would like that we continue discussing. It has been a very exciting afternoon for you. In my case, it's getting dark. And I have to say that this is going to, you know, it was great to hear that people would like to continue. So we for sure are going to organize second part in the spring. We are going to try to take some of the topics that we touched today, but also we are going to include other topics that we were not able to have more speakers coming in today. I have to say that I appreciate everybody who has do their presentations. Sadly, Florian has to leave a few minutes ago, and I don't know if Celeste is around and she can turn on her camera. I have been trying to see if she is able to do it. I want to, for the people who are still around, if you are interested in participating in our special issue with the TS, with the sedimentary record, it will be a great opportunity for you to show some of the stuff, new stuff that you are coming in. One of the beauties in a sedimentary record is that they also have an area where you can actually show preliminary results. So that is another thing that is, I would say that you should think about it. For the people who are still with us, I would have to say that I appreciate that you have been giving us so many good discussions. We will for sure start organizing this for the next spring. So thank you very much. And I'm not sure if we can do one of those panels. Cassie, I don't know, have you ever done so one of those panel photos in this format?
Do a screenshot of everybody's face here together. I don't think
yes.
A little
but you know, one of them, I have seen one of them, and it's kind of like right now everything is in one line, but well.
So I can do one of those. And again, just, you know, for everybody heading out or whatnot, thanks for taking the time to listen in. Again, Lilian did a huge amount of work to get this set up. So Lilian, thanks for that. Emma as well. She couldn't be here today, but there's a massive amount of work there. Jen and Cassie, thank you all for the support. And the presenters, I think the presentations were so interesting, and I think hit directly at what we were trying to showcase with this series of talks, that the amount of work that, or the amount of interesting topics that are there, there's a huge amount of topics, there's a lot of interest, and there's some pretty unique opportunities that are there. And I think you guys have demonstrated to everybody attending the excitement around the topics that you guys are working on, and kind of where there's some more opportunities for other people kind of that might question, you know, well, okay, I'm going to kind of pivot away from one thing or another. There's a huge amount of work that can be done in Deepwater Sed Strat still. So thank you guys for taking time to do that.
So the future looks bright.
Yes.
Especially for a lot of students who are interested in, you know, and they maybe would like each one of these areas is still a lot to do. So it's fantastic.
Absolutely. All right. Well, if you want, Lilian, I can take one of those screenshots, and I'll give us a 3-second count, and we can take that. Okay. All right. 1, 2, 3. All right. It said it was saved to my desktop. I will check that.